Hi, welcome to another episode. Please hit the subscribe button and let's begin. Since the end of the Cold War, 12 of the world's 15 deadliest conflicts have occurred in Africa, but global media has invariably focused on other conflicts. On March 2011, the massacre of particularly women by military armored personnel, which left 7 dead and more than 100 injured, was captured on video and released on YouTube. Those were citizens who had gathered to demand that Laurent Gbagbo, the then president of Ivory Coast, step down. It was a prime candidate for global media attention and outrage but failed to materialize. That video clip was a perfect storm, unarmed woman being gunned down, the military clearly visibly, but it received very little coverage, says Virgil Hawkins, author of Stealth Conflicts, How the World's Worst Violence is Ignored. Perhaps the ultimate illustration of this is the war in and around the Democratic Republic of Congo that began in the late 1990s. More than 5 million people died as a direct result of this conflict, the vast majority from preventable disease and starvation, making it the deadliest in the past 50 years. Yet most of the world remained oblivious. I don't think there's a better example of the lack of balance in international news coverage, says Guy Golan, associate professor of public relations at Syracuse University, New York. This was called the African World War, and the Western media almost completely ignored it. In the same period, major Western news corporations devoted 50 times more coverage to the conflict in Israel-Palestine, which between 1987 and 2007 led to around 7,000 deaths. In 1999, the war in Kosovo, where around 2,000 people died, received more attention and aid money than all of Africa's humanitarian emergencies combined. The border war between Ethiopia and Eritrea around the same time led to more than 100,000 deaths, but coverage of it was negligible. We have seen how terrorist attacks on a Spanish train in 2004 and a London bus in 2005 led to an international media frenzy. But when more than 250 people were killed on a train bombed by rebels in Angola in 2001, the event received little, if any, airtime or column inches. The examples run on, but the question remains, why exactly is some violence ignored? Virgil Hawkins argues that several factors influence whether a conflict gets covered in the media, including its political significance and its proximity, both geographically and culturally, to the nation covering it. Most importantly, the conflict has to be of national and political interest, he says. It also makes a difference if it is happening nearby and people are able to identify with it. If we see people in cars and large buildings getting bombed, we are more likely to identify with it than if the same thing is happening to people in mud huts. The idea of national interest includes strategic military and economic concerns. Are they a military or terrorist threat? Do they have oil? Whereas the ability to identify can be affected by language, religion, or historical ties, but is all too often reduced to such crude measures as skin color. Black-on-black violence in Africa seems to hold little interest to the Western world, but throw in a Caucasian angle such as white farmers being forced from their land in Zimbabwe, and international limelight is likely. So, it is suggested that wars in Africa are of little interest to the West because they are happening to people too far away, who are too different, living in countries that are simply not important enough. However, some argue that the amount of interest shown may have less to do with a nation's power or importance, and more to do with the general contours of the global political system. Back in 1984, James Larson, author of television's Window on the World, found that 2/3 of U.S. international news coverage was focused on the Soviet Union, with Africa, Latin America, and Asia receiving hardly any attention. The U.S.-centric media script arguably shifted to the Gulf in 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait before diverting to Bosnia and Kosovo. After 11 September 2001, Afghanistan had its turn in the limelight, followed by Iraq, again. and later with Israel-Palestine on hand as a reliable diversion throughout. Such a busy schedule left little time for the Western media to keep track of wars in, say, Liberia or Angola, where the death tolls were in the hundreds of thousands. But it's not just whether conflicts are covered, but how they are covered, which, according to several high-profile academics, is affected by the relationship between the media and the elite Western powers. In the 1990, Professor Lance Bennett found that those working in the media as part of what he called indexing theory would invariably ensure that their point of view on a given topic closely mirrored those expressed by government elites. While the press and other lesser actors could add their own viewpoints, they would usually fall within the accepted range of argument already set out by the government. If you are a media corporation, you simply do not want to go against your home government on a foreign affairs issue, as it's going to be bad for business. It could lead to a boycott or even reporters being abused or attacked, says Hawkins. While this patriotism sells view of the media as a flag-waving mirror of government policy, rings true in many cases, this relationship may also be the result of the day-to-day pressures of media production. Much of it is driven by the news culture and the nature of news cycles, says Stephen Livingston. Journalists are looking towards the next 24 hours, so rather than hunt around for their own stories, they end up going with whatever happens to be on the agenda of the government press office that day. Last year, Russia's invasion of Ukraine captured the public's attention in the West in a way that other wars like those in Yemen or Ethiopia simply haven't. Jacqueline Kemagisa, a journalist based in Uganda, said a BBC News clip of an interview with former Ukrainian official David Sakvaralidze made that point in stark and offensive terms. He described those affected by the Ukraine war as European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day. His statement was widely condemned by journalists and activists as racist. Kemagisa then posted a Twitter thread criticizing how Western media organizations have covered Ukraine. She found Sakvaralidze's sentiment highly problematic. His comment, she says, signals to the audience that this was human beings worth protecting, not the lives of people of color, lower in the hierarchy created by the world's white supremacist, capitalistic system. If we are to give sympathy, let's give it to everyone who is a victim of war, rather than selectively applying it based on location and race, says Kemagisa. The reason is obvious, says Christopher Blattman, an economist at the University of Chicago and the author of Why We Fight, The Roots of War and the Paths to Peace. This is more than a regional conflict. It's a potential global conflagration. Superpowers are taking sides. There are fears that it could lead to nuclear escalation. There have been constant reports on it until coverage just shifted to the Israel-Palestine conflict in October. Open up a newspaper, social media, or television, and chances are you will read something about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The current conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians has become one of the most widely reported conflicts in the world today. It also happens to be one of the most complicated and divisive. Why has this conflict between two small territories in the Levant region exploded into a huge global issue, whilst current conflicts in Africa have been ignored? A possible answer could lie in the multiple media coverage of the conflict. The continuous coverage of the conflict has kept it in the public eye, thus elevating its perceived importance. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has sparked protests all around the world. Millions of people are emotionally charged by the conflict due to a multitude of reasons. From religion to human rights, the media has capitalized on people's emotions concerning the conflict by increasing coverage. The increased coverage leads to more people seeing what is going on in Israel, and thus increasing its relative importance in their minds. This can be understood by the psychological phenomenon known as the availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is defined by psychologist Daniel Kahneman as the tendency to assess the relative importance of issues by the ease with which they are retrieved from memory. According to the availability heuristic, if a piece of information can be recalled quickly, then a person will be more likely to believe it is important. In terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with the media's regular reporting on the conflict, it is often at the forefront of our minds, which makes it easier for us to retrieve information about it. When information regarding the conflict is recalled easily, it will seem to be more important than information that may not come to mind as quickly. Whereas ongoing conflicts in the Sahel, where thousands are being killed and others have their human rights taken away, have been kept in the shadow. But in this age of near-ubiquitous connectivity, citizen journalism, mobile phones, and rampant social media, the problem of access is become less of an issue. Thanks for watching, and see you again in another episode of World Formatics.